Hello, I'm Father Seth Murray. I'm a priest in the Old Catholic Communion of North America, and it's my privilege to talk about this topic. Very happy to do so. Several people have asked me questions about this. I wanted to address what's been a very popular topic among Catholic apologetics lately, specifically about what's being called the new Eliakim typological argument for the papacy. And the title of this presentation here is just that it is unsound, and I think spiritually dangerous. I actually wrote this back in 2022, and had been working on it prior to that, in part because the argument that has become popular, it's not new, it's at least decades old, if not centuries, but it has become very popular recently, and it's actually the author who's popularized it, very nice man, has recently revised his presentation as well. So this is kind of a combination of addressing his earlier presentation and some of the revisions he's made. So I note here, since the first publishing of this paper in the end of 2022, Sana has revised his argument, and it looks like he did so in February of 2023. The revisions he has made are minor, and they do not address the fundamental flaws in his argument. One, that it is grounded in a not-so-hidden argument by analogy, which is always invalid. That's very important. An argument by analogy is always invalid. Two, that it is further grounded in a probabilistic claim, and his assertion that his conclusion is more probable is nothing more than a personal preference. He has no grounding in objective logic or fact, and it has no more substance than anyone else's personal preference about what is probable or desirable. Another interesting factor here is that I've been blocked from commenting not only on Sana's Intellectual Catholicism channel, but from related Roman apologist channels. It's one thing to block or silence someone because he's being crude or deliberately deceiving others, but the move among some contemporary Roman apologists to prevent people from even seeing genuine counter-arguments is disappointing. It suggests that these apologists are less interested in genuine truth than they are in perpetuating and justifying their own beliefs. And hopefully this is something we can all avoid. In any event, the reader or listener is encouraged to reach out to Sana, and if you wish, share this paper with him, or your opinion. Churches are distinguished from each other by their histories, beliefs, their doctrines and dogmas, and practices. A key distinguishing mark of the Roman Catholic Church is its belief in papal supremacy, the belief that the Pope has supreme authority over all Christians and the entire world, and that submission to that supremacy is necessary for salvation. Over the last couple of years, Sana has developed and promoted an argument that he asserts proves the truth of Roman papal supremacy, the new Eliakim typological argument for the papacy. His presentations are well-researched, organized, and persuasive. Furthermore, Sana is clearly sincere, articulate, intelligent, and a delightful person. His presentations have encouraged many who are already in full communion with Rome, and prompted some to leave their Christian faith communities to join Rome. Unfortunately, his argument is fundamentally unsound. That is, it does not prove or demonstrate its conclusion according to the generally accepted basic principles of logic. But first, we must be careful to avoid equivocation. Roman apologists, and I was among these for over 2 decades, frequently assert that they are merely arguing for the papacy, or papal primacy, when they're actually arguing for papal supremacy. They collapse, that is, conflate several distinct ideas into one. Those who question papal supremacy, if they're not careful to make necessary distinctions, get maneuvered into denying bald historical facts, and so come across as fools. But what exactly is papal supremacy? And how is it distinct from the papacy or papal primacy? The papacy has to do with a demonstrable, historically verifiable structure of the early church. Briefly and grossly oversimplified, as Christianity spread and grew in its first centuries, a geographically bounded structure developed, in which several bishops were in communion with each other and administered by a leading bishop. Several such groups existed, each representing a fully authentic geographical church and consisting of several smaller particular churches. These head bishops were and still are called patriarchs or popes. The first major churches were apostolic, or started by an apostle, and generally in communion with each other, though they sometimes had misunderstandings and disagreements. Over several decades and centuries, the Church of Rome became increasingly, even exclusively, associated with the Apostle Peter. In its simplest, stripped-down meaning, the Papacy refers to the association of the Bishop of Rome with Peter. Papal primacy adds a layer to that association. Among the various geographical churches, Rome was held in high regard for several reasons, including the historical association with both Peter and Paul, being a location of countless martyrdoms. Further, the Gospels imply a kind of special honor among the apostles for Peter, and this was then imputed to Rome. Rome also became considered a bastion of orthodoxy, and effectively became a review court among the patriarchates. That is, if a dispute could not be resolved within or among individual patriarchs, the issue could be appealed to Rome, who might offer advice on the matter, or suggest that the issue be reviewed by another patriarchate. Greater church-wide issues would prompt an ecumenical council, a meeting of the bishops of the whole church, at which the Bishop of Rome or his delegates was given special honor. Papal primacy refers to the corresponding regard to the Roman Church and to the Bishop of Rome by the regional churches. Papal supremacy is distinct from and extends papal primacy. Papal supremacy is the dogma put forth by the Church of Rome that Peter alone had special charisms given to him directly by Jesus. These include supreme, exclusive, unilateral, immediate authority over the other apostles and every particular church and Christian in the entire world. This authority is not subject to any earthly review, for example, a council, but to God alone. Infallibility, meaning that God prevents him from teaching error when he makes a pronouncement on a matter of faith or morals officially and to the entire church. Papal supremacy further asserts that these special charisms granted to Peter are passed on to and held by the subsequent Bishop of Rome up to this day, a kind of indefectibility to both the office of the Bishop of Rome as well as the Church of Rome. Again, Roman apologists routinely conflate these dimensions, papacy, papal primacy, and papal supremacy, into a single idea, as is evident even in the title of Sona's argument, and they just call it the papacy. Of course, we immediately run into a problem, for there are no scriptural passages that explicitly show Christ giving Peter these charisms, Peter or the other apostles expressing that he understands himself to have these, or of Peter exercising them. Consequently, Roman apologists read the charisms back into various passages. For example, Luke 22 records Jesus saying to Peter, "I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail." Roman apologists assert that this means that the Church of Rome and its bishop will never fail. And where Christ speaks of giving the disciples the Holy Spirit who will lead you into all truth, Roman apologists say that this refers to the infallibility of the Roman Church in general, and of the Bishop of Rome in particular. Now, these passages are certainly compatible with papal supremacy, but one would not necessarily arrive at papal supremacy from these passages. That is, we have no reason to conclude that these passages teach papal supremacy. This and similar eisegesis, reading one's own beliefs and hopes back into the text, leads to no end of problems, and we've all done it. And probably will continue to. Papal supremacy has never been proposed or accepted by any ecumenical council, nor was it accepted by the other major Christian churches. Papal supremacy was formally asserted in the decrees of the 19th century Roman Council of Vatican I, and said by the Roman Church to be of apostolic origin, to have come from Christ via the apostles. This idea is not a 19th century fabrication, but was present in some form in the Church in the Church of Rome for many centuries prior. The earliest explicit and somewhat infamous expression is arguably Unum Sanctum from 1302, in which Pope Boniface asserted quite pointedly that Christ's Church is exclusively found in the Church of Rome, and that he, Boniface, rules temporal, secular powers as well as the various churches. His bull concludes with, furthermore, we declare, we proclaim, we define that it is absolutely necessary for salvation that every human creature be subject to the Roman pontiff. The claim that salvation entails certain conditions is not new to the Judeo-Christian tradition. Prior to Christianity, salvation was held to involve following the law, seeking God, and having a humble, contrite heart before God. With the advent of Christianity, salvation was held to normatively involve belief that Jesus is God incarnate, baptism, the following of Jesus' teachings, especially of love for others, and a humble and contrite heart before God. As Christianity matured over the decades and centuries, the conditions of Christian salvation became increasingly detailed, first involving communion with the local bishop and the church community, the addition of a number of feasts and fasts, to a point where the quantity and scope of the various rules easily competes with traditional Judaism. A maxim developed that outside the church there is no salvation. This gradually evolved to include the assertion that salvation depended upon being in communion with, that is, subject to, a specific bishop in Rome. Papal supremacy is arguably the signal distinction between Rome and all other Christian expressions. Many other Christian churches can trace their history to Christ via the apostles. Many have authentic bishops and sacraments, but none save Rome assert that their bishop has supreme authority over all other churches and Christians, and that their bishop is infallible. Indeed, according to the Roman Church, papal supremacy is not merely the case, but those who do not submit to it, even if they are otherwise faithful to Christ, are damned. If papal supremacy is true, then Rome is correct, and all Christians should enter into full communion with Rome, barring some severe defect. If papal supremacy is not true, then Rome is in error and should correct itself. Sona's argument is that papal supremacy is present in and provable from Scripture. Unfortunately, Sona doesn't present a pure, formal argument for his position, full symbology, formal validation, and such. Rather, he presents 8 premises and 3 stages that he calls phases. He asserts that these, along with his various supporting claims, prove his conclusion. These constitute an informal, natural language argument, though he employs the language of formal logic throughout his presentation. Thoroughly evaluating his argument requires converting it to a formal argument. Some of this that's coming up will be tedious to read and study. I won't necessarily read every symbolic argument or a symbolic presentation I have coming up, but this complete paper will be available in the description that goes along with this video, so you're welcome to print it, read it, comment on it. Now, Sona's premises 1 through 6 can really be reduced, and I encourage you to watch his video. Absolutely encourage you to do so and study it. Study what he's said. He's put a great deal of work into this. It's clearly been something that's a passion of his, and it's to be respected. Anyway, premises 1 through 6 of his argument can be reduced really to a single alethic claim. Now, an alethic claim is an appeal to a complex form of logic called modal logic. It has to do with things that are necessary, possible, impossible, and such. A lot of our more sophisticated thinking, especially in theology, involves this dimension of logic. Now, for clarity, we'll call this premise A. It is possible that there's a textual allusion between Matthew 16 and Isaiah 22 that relates to Peter and Eliakim. This isn't really controversial, so we'll simply grant it. However, Sana would be hard-pressed to state his premise 7 in a more obscure way, but here it is as he's written it. But the textual allusions being a Peter-Eliakim typology is much more expected on the hypothesis that the papacy is true than on its negation. Now, note the conflation of the papacy. What he means is papal supremacy. He doesn't mean just the papacy, the fact that there is a bishop in Rome recognized officially as a successor to Peter. This could be refactored into something resembling a formal logic statement many different ways. The most positive way, the one most favorable to Sana's project, is here premise B. If it is possible that there's a textual allusion between Matthew 16 and Isaiah 22 that relates to Peter and Eliakim, then papal supremacy is possible. Sana's last premise, refactored, reads, and I've listed this as premise C, if premise A and premise B are true, then papal supremacy is possible. The implied conclusion is that papal supremacy is possible. I mention it's implied because I don't think he actually wrote it out on his argument list. In the language of Sana's argument, he would assert likely rather than possible. Indeed, Sana's conclusion is that papal supremacy is possible. Isn't that papal supremacy is possible or even merely likely, but that it is the case. And he seems to hold that he has successfully demonstrated as much. But he's incorrect. His argument is actually unsound. First, a valid argument is one that is properly structured. Properly structured means that it is structured such that if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. It cannot be false. Let us see if that is the case here. In this expression, T stands for there is a textual allusion between Matthew 16 and Isaiah 22 that relates to Peter and Eliakim. And P stands for papal supremacy, is true. So we basically put his premises here in kind of a almost symbolic shorthand. So premise A, possibly T. Premise B, possibly T implies possibly P. Premise C is really a kind of a complex mess here that I won't read. You're welcome to read it. But the conclusion is possibly P. Now, if we do fully symbolize this, we have a question mark T. It stands for possibly T. We have if, or basically possibly T implies possibly P. We then have this mess. And then we have possibly P. Now, the first two premises, they could be challenged. That is the possibly T and the if possibly T, then possibly P. The first two premises could be challenged, but effectively constitute a classical argument. It goes all the way back to the Stoics, called in Latin as it developed under scholasticism and categorical logic. It got the name modus ponens. Stands for affirming mode. These two alone actually support this conclusion. Now, this argument is valid without Sana's third premise, which should be left out as it is redundant. A close study of it shows that it's basically a repeat of the first two premises. Now, modus ponens is a classical argument structure, as I mentioned, can be traced back to the Stoics. Stoic logic didn't get much traction in the West, but parts of it were carried along in the wake of categorical logic, a truncation and refactoring of Aristotle's logical system that prevailed, and the Roman Catholic-dominated monastic and university systems from the Middle Ages forward until basically the middle of the 19th century. It's actually still taught in many private academies today. Modus ponens has been a fundamental and important part of contemporary symbolic logic since the beginning of the 20th century. In natural language, the basic structure is, if A is the case, then B is the case. A is the case, therefore B is the case. So it's very intuitive, almost annoyingly intuitive. Symbolized, it appears as follows. The order of the premises is irrelevant. Whether you have premise 1 and 2 switched doesn't matter. But it's basically if A, then B, or it could say A implies B, A is the case, therefore B is the case. Modus ponens is a valid argument structure if the premises are actually true and the terms are clear and consistent, then the conclusion must be true. The invocation of probabilities hinted at by Sona's consistent employment of likely and similar terms is a serious problem for his argument and for evaluating it. If the premises are true, this means that papal supremacy is at best a possibility. This doesn't mean that it is the case, which is what the Church of Rome asserts. Nor does it give us any information about how likely it is. Such considerations are largely arbitrary. Claiming or proving that papal supremacy is possible isn't especially remarkable, as countless things are possible that are not the case. Sona's approach is also rather conveniently fails to take into account any evidence against papal supremacy. This is a serious deficiency. If Sona is interested in discerning the truth, not in simply affirming a particular Roman dogma, then I think he would approach this quite a bit differently and more critically. So the general form of Sona's argument is valid, but validity alone doesn't tell us whether a conclusion is true, and in this case, even if the conclusion is true, it doesn't tell us whether papal supremacy is true. For that, we need a sound argument. And an argument can be valid and unsound. A sound argument meets 3 criteria. It is valid. Its premises are all true. Its terms are employed clearly and consistently. Most real-world arguments aren't even valid. So Sona has an accomplishment here. Of those that are valid, few are sound. Let us grant the first premise as true. Some kind of typology between Peter and Eliakim is possible. This leads us to the second premise, which asserts that the typology's possibility implies the possibility of papal supremacy. Discerning the truth of an implication is tricky, and it depends upon the facts. Sona draws upon countless sources to attempt to demonstrate that premise 2 is true. Apart from fallacious and habitual appeals to authority, that is, his citations of various scholars, attempts to justify premise 2 distill down to an argument by analogy. An argument by analogy asserts that a quality found in object A must also be present in object B because the two objects are alike or related in some other ways. Arguments by analogy are often extremely persuasive because we generally learn new things. We grow in understanding through analogy. That is, analogy is a perfectly useful way of helping someone grow an understanding of something that is already believed for other sound reasons. For example, if I'm teaching students about basic electricity, I might employ the analogy of water plumbing. A student's knowledge of plumbing, that is pressure, current, resistance, can help him understand some concepts in electronics. However, we wouldn't argue that because plumbing and electronics are analogous with respect to pressure, current, and resistance, that electricity comes in hot and cold varieties. Nor would we encourage the application of pipe wrenches to electrical outlets, nor could we rationally argue that electricity has pressure because it is like water, plumbing, which also has pressure. Analogies are helpful, but they don't actually prove anything when employed in a formal argument. except perhaps that the arguer doesn't know what he's doing. How is Sona's argument an argument by analogy? Sona asserts that Jesus established a parallel or connection between the office of the chief steward under the king of Israel, Isaiah 22, and Peter. Sona argues that on the basis of this believed connection, select characteristics of the chief steward are therefore also true for Peter, leading to papal supremacy. Now let us recall precisely what papal supremacy entails. Jesus instilled into Peter alone a supreme, universal, unilateral, and immediate authority over all of Christianity. This authority is handed on to a single successor bishop in Rome. This authority will continue without fail until Christ's return in glory. On the point of authority, it is clear that Jesus gave authority to the apostles and disciples in general. This authority included the power to forgive sin or not, to drive out demons, to heal, and to establish norms for the church. No appeal to Isaiah or obscure argument is necessary to establish this point. The contentious point is the assertion of some kind of special authority for Peter. What we do not find anywhere in Scripture or early church fathers is the Roman idea that these powers were given exclusively or in some special way to only Peter. Indeed, the Roman apologists' practice is to do exactly what they accuse others of doing. It's to silently insert the idea of alone when Christ talks about Peter having some charism or responsibility. They further ignore or dissemble passages where the same powers are clearly given to others too. The Roman apologist assumes that because authority would have been exclusive to the chief steward, it's therefore also exclusive to Peter. But this simply presumes what they claim to be demonstrating. On the point of passing the authority on, we have no evidence whatsoever that the role of chief steward was something ordained by God to be passed on to others forever. Indeed, God was quite clear from the very beginning that Israel's mere request for a king was a very bad idea, represented a rejection of God, and would not turn out well. So we have a low-level problem. By low-level, I mean something that's underneath the surface of the argument. This low-level problem in that Sona is making an argument by analogy, which is necessarily invalid, and more on that in a moment. However, we have an additional difficulty when we attempt to discern the truth of premise 2, which was that the possibility of a typology between Eliakim and Peter implies the possibilities of papal supremacy. Now, we can know that an implication claim is false if the antecedent, the first part, is true and the consequent is false. In all other cases, introductory logic courses assert that the implication should be accepted as true, but that's actually incorrect. In reality, the truth of an implication is simply unknown in other cases, unless it can be otherwise determined. If we consider Sona's argument in its most generous light, the truth of premise 2 is therefore unknown. We don't actually know. We have no reason to just accept that the possibility of some kind of typology between Eliakim and Peter implies papal supremacy. That being the case, the strongest claim that could be made regarding the certainty of the conclusion is that its truth is also unknown, since it is produced or supported from a premise with an unknown truth. But let us assume, let's be generous, let us assume that premise 2 is true. Let us also ignore the whole argument by analogy problem. Even if qualities in Eliakim can be arbitrarily imputed to Peter, we have no evidence that Eliakim had some kind of unique, unilateral, immediate authority over everyone in the nation of Israel. We also have no evidence that Eliakim was infallible. Consequently, we have no apparent reason to accept the claim as true that the possibility of a typology between Peter and Eliakim implies the possibility of papal supremacy. even if there is a typological relationship, even if all of the qualities of Eliakim are found in Peter, including his ultimate failure. This does not produce papal supremacy. Now, altogether, this isn't proof that Sona's conclusion is false. This doesn't prove impossible P, that is, or necessarily not P. What it does demonstrate, though, is that Sona's argument fails formally and informally. That is, he has not demonstrated or proven his conclusion. In addition to the formal problems, there are two practical, spiritual problems with the argument. One is that it's drawing people to Rome under fallacious pretenses. And the second is just that it's targeting other Christians. Now, the Church of Rome is an authentic expression of the Church of Christ. It's an instrument of salvation. There are many beautiful, wonderful things about it. People can and do draw closer to God and find peace in their own lives through communion with Rome. Though the movement from non-Christianity to Roman Christianity is generally going to be a net positive move, that is not so clear for transfers from other Christian groups, especially apostolic sacramental ones. It's entirely possible that Sona's argument could prompt someone to leave a Christian community in which he was on the path of salvation, enter the Roman Church under the prompting of this or other fallacious arguments, and later become disillusioned and jettison faith in Christ entirely. We probably all know people who've done that. This isn't to put all the dirt or burden on Rome either. It happens in any church. Salvation ultimately comes from God through the work of Jesus Christ and comes about in each person's heart as we accept Christ, follow his teachings and example, and share his love with others. We have no evidence or sound rationale from Scripture or history that salvation depends upon belief in a submission to the Bishop of Rome or belief in papal supremacy. But this is what Sona's argument implies. And he's not the only one to say this, of course. He's not alone in this. Many Roman apologists make similar claims, as do apologists for some other churches and religions. Now, bad arguments generally have bad consequences. Sona obviously doesn't intend bad consequences, and he clearly buys his own argument, as we always do. But that doesn't change the fact that this could unwittingly, unintentionally, spiritually harm many, many people. The fact that Sona's argument fails is not evidence that papal supremacy is false. The absence of clear, persuasive evidence for supremacy is a problem for its proponents. But the real problem is that their own claims undermine the position. Specifically, Roman apologists argue that papal supremacy is necessary to maintain desired unity in the Church. In fact, a desire for unity, a burning desire for unity, was among the motivations that led me into Roman Catholicism almost 3 decades ago. This isn't merely, if papal supremacy is true, then we will have unity, but we will have unity if and only if papal supremacy is true. The problem, of course, is that Christianity factually lacks unity. Roman apologists argue that disunity exists primarily outside of Rome, but that's hardly honest. It takes only a cursory study of history, let alone an awareness of the present divisions among Roman Christians, to see that the Roman Church has been consistently beset by divisions and schisms within itself, as well as with its sister churches. In this sense, the Roman apologists have basically made their own argument against papal supremacy, and one that's both valid and sound. Premise: we will have unity if and only if papal supremacy is true. Premise 2: we do not have unity. Therefore, papal supremacy is false. Granted, the Roman apologist will deny that the argument is sound. Its validity is unassailable. He will claim that the problem is that the people who deny papal supremacy. But that is incorrect. for the divisions within the Roman Church are largely between groups who all hold to papal supremacy. The dogma doesn't preserve unity, even among the people who believe it and claim that it is sufficient and necessary for unity. The apologist will further argue that the division schisms within Rome aren't really division or schisms in the church. They claim that these groups divide themselves from the church, and so on. I've seen this hundreds of times, if I've seen it at all, that the Roman apologist will criticize divisions outside the church. They'll talk about the thousands of denominations or the different Orthodox churches and the rivalries among them. And then if you ask, well, what about the divisions now and all through history in the Church of Rome? Oh, those aren't a big deal. It's just your divisions are bad. Mine are okay. Mine are just internal squabbles among Christians. And so it goes. In the end, Sona's argument is at best unsound, though arguably invalid in that it incorporates an argument by analogy. Further, the dogma of papal supremacy, which Roman apologists claim was instituted by Christ to maintain unity, has not only been insufficient to maintain unity within the Church of Rome, but has been a consistent cause of schism with other authentic churches. A sound argument demonstrating the truth of this dogma, has yet to be presented, despite having nearly 2,000 years to do so. And there are strong arguments that seem to demonstrate that it's false. So again, my best wishes and prayers and hopes for all. My greatest hope, really, with respect to Christianity, is that we can find greater unity among each other, with our brothers and sisters. I think that papal supremacy and pushing it, not only has it not brought about greater unity, it's actually been a cause of disunity. And I pray that can get better. In any event, God bless you all, and I welcome comments to improve this. If there's an error in my reasoning, feel free to point it out. Happy to try to come closer to the truth with everyone else who's seeking it.